What drove ordinary physicians to don grotesque, bird-like masks and venture into the realm of the dying? How did the very sight of these leather-clad figures become synonymous with death itself? What rituals and practices did these mysterious plague doctors perform in their desperate battle against the Black Death? And why did their methods, however well-intentioned, often seal the fate of those they sought to save? Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the forgotten corners of our past with the detail and care they deserve. I'm your host, and tonight we're embarking on a haunting journey through one of history's most unsettling medical chapters. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're checking in from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Whether you're settling in for the evening or finding a moment of calm in your day, you're exactly where you need to be. If you truly enjoy these explorations through history's quieter moments, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, but only if these stories genuinely resonate with you. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these forgotten tales to light. I'd also encourage you to share in the comments what historical topic you'd like us to explore next, or simply check in and let us know how you're doing. You are an invaluable part of our growing community of history enthusiasts, and your continued support means more than you know. Now, perhaps dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some gentle background noise, and settle in as we step into the shadowy world of medieval medicine, where good intentions met grim reality in the most unsettling of ways. Tonight's journey will take us through 4 distinct chapters of this dark period. We'll begin by experiencing what it was truly like to be a plague doctor in 14th century Europe, feeling the weight of that leather beak and understanding the daily horrors these men faced. Then we'll follow the remarkable story of Nostradamus during his years as a plague physician, long before his fame as a prophet. Our third exploration will uncover the mysterious medical theories that drove these eerie practices. And finally, we'll contrast this grim medical reality with the opulent lives of the wealthy, who could afford to flee the plague's reach entirely. Segment 1. Why you wouldn't last a day as a plague doctor. Imagine waking before dawn in a cramped, damp chamber above a medieval apothecary. The year is 1348, and the Black Death has been ravaging Europe for months. As you struggle to consciousness, the first sensation that greets you is in the cold stone beneath your feet or the acrid smell of herbs from below. But the overwhelming stench of death that has become as constant as breathing itself. It seeps through every crack in the walls, clings to your clothes, and haunts your dreams. This is your reality as one of the few remaining plague doctors in a city where half the population has already perished. You rise with a heaviness that isn't just physical exhaustion, though that weighs on you like a stone. It's the weight of knowing that today, like every day for the past 6 months, you will witness suffering beyond comprehension, and despite all your training, all your knowledge of Galenic medicine, you will be utterly powerless to stop it. Your hands shake slightly as you reach for the basin of water, not from fear, though fear is your constant companion, but from the sheer emotional toll of watching entire families disappear within days. The ritual of donning your protective garments begins with methodical precision, born not of habit but of desperate hope that these strange contraptions might somehow keep death at bay. First comes the long leather robe, treated with wax and oils to create a barrier between you and the corrupted air that medieval theory tells you carries the pestilence. The leather is thick and unforgiving, already stained with substances you prefer not to identify. As you pull it over your shoulders, the weight settles like armor, but armor that makes you a figure of terror rather than protection. Your hands, already trembling, struggle with the leather straps that secure the most unsettling part of your ensemble. The beak-like mask, that has become the stuff of nightmares for the living and the dying alike. The beak, fashioned from leather and filled with aromatic herbs, spices, and sometimes crushed pearls, extends nearly a foot from your face. Inside this hollow projection, you've packed dried roses, thyme, lavender, and crushed juniper berries. Anything that might combat the poisonous miasma you believe causes the plague. But the herbs offer little comfort when you realize how the mask transforms your very humanity. Your voice becomes muffled and distorted, emerging from the beak as an eerie, hollow sound that frightens children and makes grown men cross themselves. Your vision is restricted to narrow glass eye holes that fog with your breath, creating a claustrophobic tunnel view of the world. Breathing becomes labored, each inhalation filtered through dried flowers that can't mask the reality of what awaits you outside. The gloves come next, thick leather that extends past your elbows, followed by a wide-brimmed hat that completes your transformation from healer to harbinger. Looking in your small, cracked mirror, you see not a physician, but a creature from humanity's darkest imaginings. The reflection that stares back could be death himself, and perhaps, in the minds of those you treat, that's exactly what you've become. Your leather satchel contains the tools of your trade, though calling them tools suggests they might actually help someone. There's your brass-headed cane, used not for walking, but for examining patients without touching them, for lifting bedsheets to inspect buboes, and for pointing to areas of concern while maintaining what you hope is a safe distance. The cane also serves a darker purpose, one you don't like to acknowledge even to yourself. It can be used to fend off desperate family members who might try to grab you, begging for miracle cures you don't possess. Inside the satchel, wrapped in oiled cloth, are your instruments of examination and attempted treatment. Small brass cups for bloodletting, because medieval medicine insists that draining the corrupted humors might restore balance to the body. Thin metal rods for lancing the grotesque swellings that appear in the armpits, groin, and neck of plague victims. Packets of various powders and tinctures, most of them useless, some of them actively harmful, but all of them representing humanity's desperate attempt to fight an enemy they cannot understand. There are also the implements for your secondary role, one that weighs heavier on your soul than any medical failure. As a plague doctor, you're not just a healer, but a recorder of the dead, a witness for legal purposes, and sometimes, when no priest can be found, or when the church itself has abandoned a plague-ravaged district, you become the person who performs last rites. Your satchel contains a small vial of what passes for holy water, a wooden cross carved by your own hands, and parchment for recording the names and possessions of the deceased. Stepping out into the morning air, you're struck immediately by the supernatural quiet that has settled over what was once a bustling medieval city. Gone are the calls of merchants, the laughter of children, the general din of urban life. Instead, there's an oppressive silence broken only by occasional cries of grief, echoing from shuttered houses and the constant sound of cartwheels on cobblestones as the dead wagons make their endless rounds. Your first destination is always the plague house, a building that has been officially designated as infected and marked with a red cross painted on the door. The cross is accompanied by the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us," though you've begun to wonder if the Lord is listening at all. The entire household has been quarantined inside for 40 days, the period that authorities believe necessary to contain the spread of disease. What this means in practice is that healthy family members are trapped inside with the sick and dying, virtually guaranteeing that the infection will spread to everyone under that roof. As you approach the marked door, you can hear the sounds from within. Sometimes it's weeping, sometimes praying, sometimes the delirious ravings of fever. Today, it's an eerie silence that makes you pause with your gloved hand raised to knock. Silence in a plague house rarely means good news. It often means that your services as a physician are no longer needed, and your role as a recorder of the dead is about to begin. The door opens to reveal a scene that, despite months of experience, still makes your stomach clench. The single room that serves as home for an entire family has become a charnel house. Bodies lie where they fell, some on straw pallets, others collapsed beside their beds. The smell is indescribable, a combination of unwashed bodies, festering wounds, human waste, and the sweet, cloying odor of decay. Even through your herb-filled beak, the stench is overwhelming. A single survivor, a girl who cannot be more than 12, sits in the corner clutching a wooden doll. She looks up at your approach, and the terror in her eyes as she takes in your bird-like appearance is almost unbearable. To her, you're not a healer, but a monster, a creature that appears when families die. She scrambles backward, pressing herself against the wall, and you realize that in trying to protect yourself from death, you've become its very embodiment. Your examination of the bodies must be thorough, not because you believe you can help them now, but because the authorities require detailed records of plague symptoms and progression. You use your cane to lift clothing and examine the distinctive buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that give the bubonic plague its name. These grotesque swellings, sometimes as large as apples, appear black and putrid, filled with blood and pus that speaks to the body's futile attempt to fight an infection it cannot comprehend. Each body tells a story of agony, the blackened fingers and toes that give the plague another of its names, the Black Death, the hemorrhaging beneath the skin that creates dark blotches across the torso, the dried blood around the mouth from the violent coughing that marks the pneumonic form of the disease. Every symptom is a reminder of your complete helplessness in the face of this pandemic. But your duties aren't finished with the dead. The surviving child requires your attention, though you know with sick certainty that she's almost certainly infected. The incubation period for the plague is typically 2 to 6 days, and she's been living in this contaminated space for longer than that. You examine her as gently as you can through the barrier of your costume, looking for the telltale fever, the beginning swellings, the signs that will confirm her fate. Your treatment options are medieval medicine at its most desperate and ineffective. You might recommend bloodletting, opening a vein to drain what you believe are corrupted humors. You might apply poultices of crushed herbs to any swellings you find, more for the comfort of doing something than from any belief in their efficacy. You carry tinctures of various metals and minerals, expensive preparations that do nothing except perhaps hasten death through poisoning. Sometimes, if you're fortunate, a patient presents with only the early signs of infection, and you can retreat behind the comfortable fiction that your treatments might help. You can lance small buboes, drain the pus, and pack the wounds with herbs. You can prescribe rest, clean water, and prayers, knowing that if the patient survives, it will be despite your ministrations rather than because of them. But more often, you're called to households where hope has already died along with most of the family members. Your role becomes that of a grim bureaucrat, cataloguing possessions that will need to be burned, recording names for parish records, and providing what comfort you can to the dying. You find yourself offering last rites more often than medical treatment, speaking words of spiritual comfort while dressed like the angel of death. The psychological toll of this existence is something no medical training could have prepared you for. Each house you enter, each family you fail to save, adds another weight to your soul. You begin to see plague victims in your dreams, their faces blending together into an endless parade of suffering. You start to avoid mirrors, not just because of your grotesque appearance, but because you can see the haunted look in your own eyes, the expression of someone who has witnessed more death than any human should. Your social isolation is complete. Healthy people flee at your approach, crossing themselves and muttering prayers. Other physicians have either died, fled the city, or refused to treat plague patients. You eat alone, sleep alone, and carry the burden of your terrible knowledge alone. You know things about suffering that you wish you could forget, have seen humanity stripped to its most desperate core, have witnessed the complete breakdown of social order in the face of inexplicable catastrophe. The irony that haunts your every waking moment is that despite all your education, all your study of Galen and Hippocrates, all your knowledge of the four humours and the balance of hot and cold, wet and dry, you are absolutely no more effective than a complete amateur would be. Your treatments often make patients worse. Your bloodletting weakens people who need every bit of strength to fight the infection. Your metallic tinctures poison already struggling systems. Your very presence, intended to bring healing, instead brings terror to the sick and dying. As the day progresses and you move from house to house, the reality of your situation becomes increasingly clear. You are not a healer, but a witness, not a physician, but a recorder of humanity's darkest hour. Your bird-like costume, intended to protect you from disease, has instead transformed you into a symbol of death itself. And perhaps most terrifying of all, you're beginning to realize that despite all your precautions, despite your IBs and your leather barriers and your careful rituals, you are almost certainly going to die of the very disease you're trying to fight. The statistics are unavoidable. Plague doctors rarely survive plague outbreaks, whether from direct infection, from the stress and exhaustion of their duties, or from the dangerous treatments they attempt. Most of those who don the leather beak never live to remove it. You are walking through your final days, administering useless treatments to the dying, while waiting for the first signs of fever to appear in your own body. This is the reality that no romanticized account of medieval medicine can capture. This is why you wouldn't last a day as a plague doctor, not because of the physical discomfort or the gruesome sights, but because of the crushing psychological weight of being humanity's representative in its darkest hour, knowing that your every action is futile, and that you are likely documenting not just the deaths of your patients, but the final chapter of your own life as well. As the afternoon sun begins its descent, casting long shadows through the nearly empty streets, you find yourself standing before another marked door. This one belongs to a merchant family, people who just weeks ago were among the city's most prosperous citizens. Their house, normally bustling with servants and business associates, now stands silent except for the faint sound of labored breathing from within. You knock with your cane, the hollow sound echoing down the deserted street, and wait for someone to answer. The door opens slowly, revealing not a servant but the merchant himself. A man you recognize from better times when he would pass you in the market square, always impeccably dressed and radiating the confidence of success. Now he stands before you in a stained nightshirt, his face gaunt and covered in sweat, his eyes holding the desperate hope of someone clinging to the possibility of salvation. He doesn't recoil from your bird-like appearance as others have. Instead, he almost falls toward you, begging you to save his wife and children who lie sick upstairs. You follow him up narrow stairs to the second floor, where the family's living quarters tell a story of rapid descent from comfort to chaos. Fine tapestries still hang on the walls, but they're surrounded by the detritus of sickness. Chamber pots that haven't been emptied, plates of untouched food now covered in flies. and scattered medicines purchased from every charlatan and quack who passed through before the plague drove them away. The merchant, he explains between gasping breaths, that he sent his servants away when the first symptoms appeared, trying to protect them, not realizing that he was condemning his family to face this nightmare alone. His wife lies in the master bedroom, a woman you remember seeing at church services, always elegant and composed. Now she writhes on sweat-soaked sheets, her skin burning with fever so intense you can feel the heat radiating from her body even through your leather gloves. The buboes have already formed, massive swellings in her armpits and groin that have turned her body into a landscape of agony. She barely registers your presence, lost in the delirium that often accompanies the plague's final stages. In the adjacent room, 2 children lie side by side on a bed meant for one. A boy of perhaps 8 years and a girl who cannot be more than 5. The boy is further along in the disease's progression, his breathing shallow and rapid, his small body already showing the telltale blackening of extremities that signals the end is near. The girl still has some awareness left, and when she sees your masked face looming over her, she begins to cry, not from pain, but from pure terror at your appearance. You examine each family member with a thoroughness that serves no real medical purpose, but provides some small comfort to the merchant, who hovers nearby, asking questions you cannot honestly answer. Will they recover? How long before the fever breaks? Is there anything at all, that can be done? You want to tell him the truth, that his wife will likely be dead by morning, that his son has perhaps hours left, and that his daughter, while still in the early stages, shows no signs that suggest she'll fare any better than her mother and brother. But you cannot bring yourself to extinguish the last flicker of hope in his eyes. Instead, you fall back on the standard treatments that you know are useless. You lance the largest bubo on the wife's body, releasing a flood of putrid fluid that does nothing to slow the disease's progress. You prepare a tincture of metals and herbs for the children, carefully measuring ingredients that might make them more comfortable but will not save their lives. You instruct the merchant on keeping them cool with damp cloths, on encouraging them to drink water, on praying for divine intervention that you increasingly doubt will come. As you work, you become aware that the merchant himself is infected. The way he moves with increasing stiffness, the flush in his cheeks that isn't just from exertion, the occasional wince when he raises his arm, all point to buboes beginning to form beneath his clothing. He knows it too. You can see the knowledge in his eyes. The acceptance that he's not summoning you to save his family, but to bear witness to their collective ending. This entire household will be dead within days, and there's nothing you or anyone else can do to prevent it. Before you leave, the merchant presses a heavy purse of coins into your hands, payment far exceeding the customary fee for a house call. You try to refuse, knowing that money will do him no good where he's going, but he insists with a ferocity that seems to come from his last reserves of strength. He wants to pay, needs to pay, as if proper compensation might somehow transform this visit from a death watch into actual medical care. You accept the purse, knowing that the coins will need to be boiled before you can spend them, another ritual of purification in a world where everything feels contaminated. Walking back through the streets as twilight descends, you pass the dead carts making their rounds. The collectors, usually criminals or desperately poor men who took this job because no one else would, call out their eternal refrain, "Bring out your dead." Bodies are brought to windows and doors, handed over with barely a word, loaded onto carts already piled with corpses in various states of decay. The collectors wear cloth masks, soaked in vinegar, far less elaborate than your costume, but probably just as effective, which is to say, not at all. You wonder how long they'll survive, these men who handle plague corpses all day, every day. You encounter another plague doctor near the city's main square, one of only 3 others still working in this district. You recognize him by his slightly different mask design, the beak a bit shorter, the leather a shade darker. You don't speak, there's nothing to say that hasn't been said 100 times already. But you exchange a brief nod, an acknowledgement of shared burden that requires no words. Tomorrow, one of you might be dead, or both of you, or perhaps you'll both survive another day to witness more suffering you cannot prevent. The apothecary where you rent your room is still open, the owner one of the few merchants who hasn't fled or died. He's making a fortune selling useless remedies to desperate people, but you can't entirely condemn him for it. Everyone is trying to survive in whatever way they can, and if false hope can be purchased for a few coins, perhaps that's not entirely without value. He nods to you as you enter, asks about your day in a tone that suggests he doesn't really want to know the answer, and returns to grinding some aromatic substance that will be sold as plague prevention to someone who can't afford to leave the city. In your room, the process of removing your protective equipment feels like shedding a second skin. Each piece comes off slowly, carefully, to avoid any possible contamination. The gloves are hung to air in the window. The robe is brushed with a stiff bristle brush to remove any clinging particles of death. The mask is emptied of its now wilted herbs and refilled with fresh materials for tomorrow. Your hands shake as you work, partly from exhaustion, but mostly from the accumulated stress of the day. You light a single candle and sit on your narrow bed, trying to eat the simple meal of bread and cheese that you purchased this morning. The food tastes like ashes in your mouth, your appetite destroyed by the sights and smells of the day. You force yourself to eat anyway, knowing that you need strength for tomorrow, and all the tomorrows until either the plague burns itself out or you become one of its victims. Sleep, when it finally comes, is haunted by the faces of those you couldn't save, the merchant's desperate eyes, the little girl's terrified expression when she saw your mask, the countless others you've watched die despite your best efforts. You dream of drowning in a sea of black bile, of buboes sprouting from your own body like grotesque flowers, of wearing your bird mask so long that it fuses with your face and you can never remove it. You wake gasping in the darkness, unsure for a moment whether you're still dreaming or if the nightmare of your waking life has simply continued. This is the existence of a plague doctor, a cycle of futile treatment and witnessed death that continues day after day, week after week, until the plague finally releases its grip on the city or claims you as another victim. There's no glory in this work, no satisfaction of lives saved or grateful patients recovering. There's only the grim duty of bearing witness to humanity's suffering, of maintaining the pretense of medical care when everyone involved knows the truth, and of walking each day toward an end that grows more certain with every house call you make. The prophet who started as a plague fighter, the story of Michel de Nostradame. Long before the world knew him as Nostradamus, the enigmatic prophet whose quatrains would captivate and confound humanity for centuries, there lived a young man named Michel de Nostradame, who walked the plague-ravaged streets of Renaissance France with nothing more than his medical training, an unshakable determination to heal, and methods so unconventional that his colleagues dismissed him as either a genius or a madman. This is the story of how the future seer of kings and emperors began his career not by gazing into crystal balls or consulting celestial charts, but by confronting the Black Death with innovations that would save thousands of lives and establish his reputation decades before he ever penned his first prophetic verse. Michel de Nostradame was born in December 1503 in the sun-drenched province of Provence, in the small town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, where the air carried the scent of lavender and the promise of a world far removed from the medical horrors that would later define his early career. His family, recent converts from Judaism to Christianity, had taken the name Nostradame, meaning Our Lady, as both protection and proclamation of their new faith in an era when religious identity could mean the difference between prosperity and persecution. From his earliest years, Michel displayed an insatiable curiosity about the natural world that set him apart from his peers. While other children played with wooden toys, he collected arbs and examined insects with an intensity that both fascinated and worried his parents. His grandfather, Jean de Saint-Remy, recognized this unusual intellect and took personal responsibility for the boy's education, teaching him not only Latin and Greek, but also mathematics, astronomy, and the forbidden arts of what some whispered was Jewish mysticism, knowledge that had been carefully preserved despite the family's public conversion. By the time Michel reached adolescence, it was clear that conventional education would not satisfy his voracious appetite for learning. He was sent to the University of Avignon, where he immersed himself in the liberal arts. But his true passion lay in understanding the human body and the diseases that ravaged it. The medieval approach to medicine, with its reliance on bloodletting and the balancing of humors, struck him as not just ineffective, but actively harmful. Even as a student, he began developing theories that would later revolutionize plague treatment, ideas so radical that his professors viewed them with deep suspicion. When Michel announced his intention to study medicine at the prestigious University of Montpellier, his family supported his ambition, though they could hardly have imagined the path his career would take. Montpellier was renowned throughout Europe for its medical faculty, a place where the greatest minds of the age gathered to push the boundaries of medical knowledge. Yet, even in this environment of intellectual exploration, Michel's approaches were considered dangerously unconventional. His first encounter with formal medical training revealed the vast gulf between theoretical knowledge and practical application. The university taught medicine as it had been practiced for centuries, based on the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates, with an emphasis on maintaining the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Students learned to diagnose illness by examining urine color and consistency, to treat disease through bloodletting and purging, and to accept that many conditions were simply beyond human intervention. Michel absorbed this traditional knowledge, but never fully embraced it. During his clinical training, he observed that patients subjected to extensive bloodletting often grew weaker rather than stronger, that purging the stomach frequently led to dangerous dehydration, and that the elaborate herbal concoctions prescribed by senior physicians seemed to have little effect on patient outcomes. More troubling still, he noticed that physicians themselves had remarkably high mortality rates when treating plague victims, suggesting that their protective measures were fundamentally flawed. These observations led Michel to begin developing his own theories about disease, transmission, and treatment. Drawing on knowledge that may have been passed down through his family's rabbinical traditions, combined with his own careful observations, he began to formulate ideas about hygiene and cleanliness that would not be widely accepted by the medical community for another 3 centuries. He theorized that disease spread not through corrupted air, as commonly believed, but through contact with infected materials and contaminated water sources. His graduation from Montpellier in 1529 marked the beginning of what would become one of the most remarkable medical careers of the Renaissance, though it began not with immediate success, but with a period of wandering that would test every aspect of his character and training. Rather than establishing a comfortable practice among the wealthy merchants and nobility of a major city, Michel chose to venture into the countryside, where news was arriving of plague outbreaks that were decimating entire communities. The decision to become an itinerant physician treating plague victims was not just professionally risky, but potentially suicidal. The mortality rate among plague doctors was so high that many considered the profession a form of elaborate suicide. Yet Michel felt compelled to test his theories in the crucible of real crisis, to discover whether his unconventional ideas about hygiene and treatment could actually save lives when conventional medicine had so obviously failed. His first major test came in the town of Again, where a severe outbreak of plague had killed nearly a third of the population within 6 months. The local physicians had either fled or died, leaving the surviving population to face their fate with whatever folk remedies and prayers they could muster. When Michel arrived in the summer of 1531, wearing simple traveling clothes rather than the intimidating leather costume of a traditional plague doctor, many residents initially mistook him for just another refugee fleeing the disease. What happened next would establish Michel's reputation throughout southern France and demonstrate that his radical theories about disease treatment were not just academic speculation, but practical innovations that could save lives. Instead of following the standard protocol of bloodletting and purging, Michel implemented a treatment regimen that seemed almost absurdly simple to his contemporaries, but was actually centuries ahead of its time in terms of medical understanding. His first innovation was the creation of what he called rose pills, a preparation made from rose petals, sawdust, and a secret mixture of herbs that he administered to patients in the early stages of plague infection. Unlike the violent purges and bloodletting favored by conventional physicians, these pills were designed to support the body's natural defenses rather than weaken them further. The exact composition of these pills remains one of history's medical mysteries, as Michel deliberately kept the formula secret, but their effectiveness was undeniable. More revolutionary still was Michel's insistence on what he termed cleanliness, protocols that extended far beyond anything practiced by contemporary physicians. He required that all bedding and clothing of plague victims be burned immediately, that water used for drinking and washing be boiled before use, and that the rooms of recovering patients be aired out daily and exposed to direct sunlight whenever possible. These practices, which seemed like mere eccentricities to 16th century observers, were actually sophisticated applications of principles that would not be formally recognized by medical science until the discovery of germ theory in the 19th century. Perhaps most importantly, Michel refused to wear the traditional plague doctor costume that made physicians appear as harbingers of death to their patients. Instead, he covered his face with a simple cloth mask soaked in aromatic vinegar, wore a long coat that could be easily washed and changed, and insisted on frequent hand washing with a solution he prepared from wine, vinegar, and crushed herbs. His appearance, while still protective, was far less terrifying to patients, allowing him to provide not just physical treatment, but psychological comfort that conventional plague doctors, hidden behind their bird-like masks, could never offer. The results of Michel's unconventional approach were nothing short of miraculous by 16th century standards. In Again, where the death rate from plague had been running at nearly 90%. Patients treated by Michel survived at rates that seemed impossible to his contemporaries. Word of his success spread rapidly throughout the region, carried by survivors who credited him with saving not just their lives, but those of their entire families. From Again, Michel was summoned to Toulouse, where city officials were desperate enough to try anything that might halt a plague outbreak there, was threatening to destroy one of France's most important commercial centers. Here, Michel's innovations proved effective on an even larger scale. Working with local authorities, he implemented citywide sanitation measures that included the systematic removal and burning of refuse, the cleaning of public wells, and the establishment of quarantine procedures that were based on actual understanding of disease transmission rather than superstition. His success in Toulouse brought Michel to the attention of some of the most powerful figures in France, including members of the royal court who were always concerned about plague outbreaks that might threaten their own health and that of the king. Invitations began arriving from cities throughout southern France, each desperate for the services of the physician who seemed capable of achieving what conventional medicine could not. The town of Salon-de-Provence became Michel's base of operations during the most intensive period of his plague-fighting career. Here, he established what amounted to a medical school, where he trained other physicians in his methods, though he was careful never to reveal all of his secrets. His students learned to prepare simplified versions of his rose pills, to implement basic sanitation measures, and to treat patients with gentleness rather than the aggressive interventions favored by traditional medicine. It was during his time in Salines that Michel began to develop the broader philosophical framework that would later inform his prophetic writings. His experience with plague had taught him that the future was not fixed, that human action could alter outcomes that seemed inevitable, and that careful observation of patterns could sometimes reveal what others might consider supernatural insights. These ideas would later manifest in his famous centuries, but their origins lay in his medical practice, where he learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished patients who would recover from those who would not. The financial rewards of Michel's medical success allowed him a degree of independence that was rare for physicians of his era. Unlike his colleagues, who depended on the patronage of wealthy families or the support of religious institutions, Michel could choose his cases based on medical need rather than political or economic considerations. This freedom enabled him to continue developing his methods and to treat patients who could never have afforded conventional medical care. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Michel's plague-fighting career was how it shaped his understanding of human nature under extreme stress. In the plague houses and quarantine centers where he worked, he witnessed the complete breakdown of social conventions, saw how quickly civilization could dissolve when faced with inexplicable catastrophe, and observed the patterns of behavior that emerged when people believed the world was ending. These insights into human psychology under crisis would later inform his prophetic writings, giving them a psychological sophistication that set them apart from the crude predictions of other supposed seers. The end of Michel's intensive plague-fighting period came, not through any failure of his methods, but through the natural ebb and flow of epidemic disease. By the late 1530s, the major plague outbreaks that had provided the testing ground for his innovations had largely subsided, at least temporarily. Michel found himself in the unusual position of a plague doctor whose services were no longer desperately needed, a victim of his own success in helping communities develop the knowledge and practices necessary to prevent future outbreaks. This transition period marked the beginning of Michel's transformation from physician to prophet, though he never completely abandoned his medical practice. The analytical skills he had developed while fighting plague, his ability to discern patterns that others missed, and his understanding of how individual actions could influence seemingly inevitable outcomes would all contribute to the development of his prophetic methodology. The man who had become Nostradamus was forged in the crucible of plague medicine, shaped by success achieved through methods that challenged every assumption of his era. Looking back on Michel de Nostradam's plague-fighting career, we can see how this period of his life established the foundation for everything that followed. His medical innovations demonstrated an understanding of disease transmission that was centuries ahead of his time. His treatment methods saved thousands of lives, and his experience with human behavior under extreme stress gave him insights that would later inform his prophetic writings. Most importantly, his success in fighting plague established his reputation as someone who could achieve the impossible, a reputation that would later make kings and queens seek his counsel on matters of state and prophecy. The young physician who walked into plague ravaged again in 1531 emerged from his decade of epidemic fighting as one of the most respected medical practitioners in France. But more than that, he had become someone who understood that the future was not fixed. That careful observation could reveal hidden patterns, and that individual human action could alter the course of events that seemed inevitable. These were the insights that would transform Michel de Nostradame from a successful plague doctor into Nostradamus, the prophet whose name would echo through the centuries. The personal cost of Michel's plague-fighting career, however, was far greater than history often acknowledges. During his time in Agen, Michel had fallen deeply in love with a young woman from a respected local family. Her name has been lost to history, one of those small tragedies of incomplete records. But we know that she brought him a happiness he had never expected to find amidst the carnage of his medical practice. They married in 1534, and within 2 years, she had given him 2 children, a son and a daughter, whose births seemed to promise a future beyond the endless cycle of plague and death. For a brief period, Michel allowed himself to believe that he might build a normal life, that his success in fighting plague had earned him the right to domestic happiness. He reduced his traveling practice, spending more time with his growing family in their comfortable home, and again, his wife supported his work, understanding that his calling to heal was as much a part of him as his love for her. The children, still too young to understand their father's dangerous profession, knew only that he was frequently away, but always returned with stories and small gifts from his travels. The tragedy that struck Michel's household arrived with cruel irony in 1537. An outbreak of plague reached. Again, despite all the preventive measures he had helped implement throughout the region, Michel's medical knowledge, his innovative treatments, his careful protocols that had saved thousands of strangers, proved utterly useless when it came to protecting his own family. His wife fell ill first, followed within days by both children. Michel applied every technique he had developed, used his most effective preparations, and watched helplessly as the 3 people he loved most in the world succumbed to the very disease he had dedicated his life to fighting. The psychological devastation of this loss nearly destroyed Michel completely. For months, he withdrew from medical practice entirely, unable to face the sick and dying when he had failed so utterly to save his own family. His colleagues and friends worried that the brilliant physician who had achieved so much would be lost to despair. Some accounts suggest that during this dark period, Michel began exploring the mystical and prophetic arts that would later define his fame, seeking in astrology and divination the answers that Medicine had failed to provide. But Michel's return to plague medicine, when it finally came, was driven by a profound realization that would shape the rest of his life and work. He understood that the unpredictability of disease, the randomness of who lived and who died, suggested that the future was not predetermined, but existed in a state of constant possibility. His family's death had not been inevitable, just as the survival of his many patients had not been guaranteed. This insight, born from terrible personal loss, became the foundation for both his continued medical work and his later prophetic writings. His return to active practice took him to Marseille in 1544, where another major plague outbreak was devastating the port city. Michel's approach to medicine had changed, however, tempered by personal tragedy, but also deepened by a more nuanced understanding of fate and human agency. He no longer saw his role as simply preventing death, an impossible task he now understood, but rather as maximizing the possibilities for survival while acknowledging that outcomes remained fundamentally uncertain. It was during the Marseille outbreak that Michel's reputation reached its zenith as a plague physician. The city's desperation was so complete that authorities gave him unprecedented freedom to implement his methods without the interference of traditional physicians who had previously criticized his unorthodox approaches. Michel essentially took control of the city's medical response, implementing sanitation measures, treatment protocols, and preventive strategies on a scale never before attempted. The results were remarkable enough to reach the attention of the French royal court. While Marseille still suffered significant mortality, the death rate was dramatically lower than in comparable cities, and the outbreak was contained far more quickly than historical patterns would have predicted. Michel's detailed records of the epidemic, including careful documentation of which treatments worked and which failed, provided evidence of medical thinking that was centuries ahead of its time. During the Marseille epidemic, Michel also began developing the network of aristocratic patrons who would later support his work as a prophet and astrologer. Wealthy families whose members survived his treatment became devoted supporters, spreading word of his abilities throughout the highest levels of French society. These connections would prove crucial when Michel eventually transitioned from active medical practice to the prophetic work that would make him famous. But they were earned through years of dangerous, exhausting work in the plague houses of Renaissance France. The physical toll of Michel's plague-fighting years also cannot be ignored. By his mid-40s, he suffered from various chronic ailments, likely contracted during his medical work. He experienced periodic fevers, joint pain, and respiratory problems that plagued him for the rest of his life. Some medical historians believe he may have survived a mild case of plague himself, though he never explicitly confirmed this. His body bore the scars of a career spent in the most dangerous medical environment imaginable, proof that even the most successful plague doctor paid a heavy price for their work. Michel's final years as an active plague physician came in the early 1550s, by which point he had established himself in Salon de Provence with his second wife, Anne Ponsardy, who had given him 6 more children. His medical practice had evolved to focus more on consultation and training than direct treatment, though he never completely abandoned his commitment to fighting plague when outbreaks occurred. The transition from physician to prophet was gradual rather than sudden, with Michel maintaining his medical credentials and practice even as his prophetic writings began to attract attention from across Europe. The publication of his first almanac in 1550 marked the beginning of this new phase. But it's crucial to understand that Michel never saw prophecy as separate from medicine. Both, in his view, involved careful observation of patterns, understanding of natural laws, and recognition that the future existed in a state of possibility rather than fixed certainty. His medical experience had taught him to read subtle signs that others missed, to understand how small interventions could alter seemingly inevitable outcomes, and to recognize that knowledge itself was a form of power over fate. The dark science behind the mask, unraveling the mysterious medical theories of plague medicine. In the shadowy realm of medieval and Renaissance medicine, where superstition danced with emerging science and desperation drove innovation, the plague doctors operated according to medical theories that seem almost alien to our modern understanding. Yet these bizarre beliefs and practices weren't random acts of medieval ignorance, but rather represented humanity's most serious attempt to understand and combat a disease that defied every assumption about how the natural world functioned. Behind the leather beaks and ritualistic treatments lay a complex web of medical philosophy, astronomical calculations, and chemical experimentation that reveals as much about the medieval mind as it does about the plague itself. The foundation of plague medicine rested on the ancient theory of the 4 humors, a medical philosophy that had dominated Western thinking for over 1,000 years before the first plague doctor ever donned his leather costume. According to this system, developed by the Greek physician Galen and refined by countless scholars, the human body contained 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with specific qualities, blood being hot and moist, phlegm cold and moist, yellow bile hot and dry, and black bile cold and dry. Perfect health existed only when these humors maintained precise balance, and disease resulted from their disruption. When the Black Death first swept across Europe in the 14th century, physicians immediately attempted to understand it within this humoral framework. They theorized that the plague represented a catastrophic imbalance of the humors, specifically an excess of black bile, which explained the disease's association with melancholy, despair, and the characteristic blackening of extremities that gave the plague one of its most terrifying names. This diagnosis seemed to fit perfectly with observed symptoms: the dark swellings, the blackened fingers and toes, the deep depression that seemed to accompany infection, all pointing to an overwhelming dominance of the cold, dry humor of black bile. But the humoral theory alone couldn't explain the plague's rapid spread or its seemingly random selection of victims. This led medieval physicians to embrace a more complex understanding that incorporated astronomical influences, environmental factors, and what they termed corrupted air or miasma. The result was a medical philosophy that combined careful observation with elaborate theoretical constructs, creating a system of plague medicine that was simultaneously sophisticated and fundamentally flawed. The concept of miasma, or poisoned air, became central to plague medicine and directly influenced the development of the iconic plague doctor costume. Medieval physicians believed that disease could spread through corrupted atmospheric conditions, particularly air that had been tainted by rotting organic matter, stagnant water, or the exhalations of sick individuals. This theory wasn't entirely wrong. Epidemics did often coincide with poor sanitary conditions and overcrowding, but the medieval understanding of transmission mechanisms was backward. They believed that simply breathing bad air could cause disease, failing to understand that the real culprit was often contaminated water or the fleas that thrived in unsanitary conditions. The elaborate beak-like masks worn by plague doctors were specifically designed to combat this perceived threat of corrupted air. The extended leather proboscis wasn't merely protective equipment, but rather a sophisticated piece of medical technology based on the theory that aromatic substances could purify poisoned atmosphere before it reached the physician's lungs. The herbs, spices, and other materials packed into these beaks weren't chosen randomly, but were selected according to complex pharmaceutical theories that governed medieval medicine. Rose petals, one of the most common ingredients found in plague doctor masks, were believed to possess cooling properties that could counteract the hot, corrupt vapors thought to carry plague. Thyme was included for its association with courage and strength, qualities that physicians desperately needed when facing the plague. Lavender was thought to calm the mind and prevent the melancholy that might make a physician more susceptible to disease. Crushed pearls, when affordable, were added because they're cool. Moist nature was believed to counteract the hot, dry corruption of plague air. But the contents of plague doctor masks reveal an even more complex understanding of disease prevention. Many physicians included metallic elements like ground silver or gold, believing that these noble metals possessed inherent purity that could neutralize corruption. Some added fragments of precious stones, particularly emeralds and sapphires, which were thought to have protective properties against poison. The most exotic masks contained unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, which was believed to be the ultimate antidote to any form of corruption or poison. The theoretical framework that governed these choices drew heavily on the medieval concept of sympathetic medicine. The idea that substances with similar properties could influence each other across distances. According to this thinking, wearing pure, aromatic, and noble substances close to one's face could somehow attract and neutralize the corrupt influences that cause plague. The plague doctor's mask wasn't just protection, but a kind of mobile laboratory designed to continuously purify the air around the physician. The long leather robes worn by plague doctors were equally rooted in medical theory, though these theories reveal a more sophisticated understanding of disease transmission than is often credited to medieval medicine. The leather was typically treated with various waxes and oils, creating a surface that could theoretically repel the corrupt vapors that carried disease. More importantly, these treatments created a barrier that could be easily cleaned, and many plague doctors insisted on having their robes cleaned with vinegar and aromatic solutions after each patient encounter. The choice of leather itself reflected medieval understanding of material properties. Leather was considered a semi-living substance, having once been part of an animal, and was therefore thought to possess natural resistance to corruption. The thickness and treatment of plague doctor leather was specifically designed to prevent the penetration of corrupt influences while allowing the physician to maintain mobility and dexterity. Some robes incorporated metallic threads, particularly silver wire, which was believed to enhance the garment's protective properties. The wide-brimmed hats that completed the plague doctor ensemble served multiple theoretical purposes beyond simple protection from the elements. The broad brim was thought to deflect corrupt vapors away from the physician's head, while the dark color, usually black, was believed to absorb harmful influences before they could reach the wearer. Some hats incorporated amulets or small pouches containing protective substances, turning the entire headpiece into a complex piece of protective equipment. The brass-headed canes carried by plague doctors represented another fascinating intersection of medical theory and practical necessity. The brass was chosen not just for its durability, but for its supposed ability to resist corruption and poison. Medieval physicians believed that brass possessed inherent purity that made it ideal for examining plague victims without risking contamination. The length of these canes was carefully calculated to maintain what physicians believed was a safe distance from corrupted air, while still allowing for effective examination. But the canes served purposes beyond simple examination. Many were hollow and filled with aromatic substances, turning them into mobile incense burners that could continuously purify the air around the physician. Others incorporated small bells or chimes, based on the theory that certain sounds could dispel corrupt influences. The most elaborate canes contained hidden compartments for storing antidotes or protective amulets, making them portable apothecaries designed to combat every aspect of plague corruption. The pharmaceutical theories that governed plague medicine reveal perhaps the most complex aspect of medieval medical thinking. Plague doctors carried elaborate collections of tinctures, powders, and preparations, each designed according to specific theoretical principles about disease, causation, and treatment. These weren't random folk remedies, but carefully formulated medications based on sophisticated understanding of how various substances interacted with the human body. The concept of theriac, a universal antidote that could counteract any poison or corruption, played a central role in plague medicine. Original theriac contained dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh, which was believed to provide immunity to poison through the principle that like cures like. Plague doctors carried simplified versions of theriac, usually containing herbs and spices that were thought to possess general protective properties against corruption. Metal-based medicines were particularly important in plague treatment, reflecting medieval understanding of the relationship between terrestrial and celestial influences. Gold preparations were reserved for the wealthy, believed to possess solar properties that could strengthen the heart and resist corruption. Silver medicines were more commonly used, thought to have lunar influences that could cool fever and purify corrupt humors. Mercury preparations, despite their obvious toxicity, were considered essential for treating plague, because mercury was believed to possess unique properties that allowed it to combine with and neutralize corrupt substances. The timing of medical treatments was as important as their composition, reflecting the deep integration of astronomy into medieval medicine. Plague doctors consulted detailed astrological charts to determine the most propitious times for bloodletting, the administration of medicines, and even the approach to infected households, the position of the moon, the dominance of particular planets, and the overall celestial configuration were all considered crucial factors in determining whether treatments would succeed or fail. Bloodletting, the most common plague treatment, was governed by elaborate rules about timing, location, and technique. The phase of the moon determined whether blood should be drawn from veins or arteries, while the position of various planets influenced which parts of the body should be treated. The amount of blood to be drawn was calculated according to the patient's age, constitution, and the specific humoral imbalance believed to be causing their symptoms. The practice of lancing buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that were the plague's most characteristic symptom, revealed another aspect of medieval medical theory. Physicians believed that these swellings represented the body's attempt to concentrate and expel corrupt humors, making them natural targets for treatment. The timing of lancing was crucial, as premature intervention might drive corruption back into the body, while delayed treatment might allow corruption to spread. Plague doctors used complex calculations involving the patient's pulse, urine, color, and astrological factors to determine the optimal moment for surgical intervention. Perhaps most fascinating were the elaborate rituals that surrounded plague medicine, practices that reveal the deep integration of spiritual and medical thinking in medieval culture. Plague doctors often began their treatments with prayers and incantations, designed to invoke divine protection and ensure the success of their medical interventions. These weren't mere superstitions, but reflected the medieval understanding that successful healing required both physical and spiritual elements. The preparation of medicines involved ritualistic elements that were considered as important as the ingredients themselves. Herbs had to be gathered at specific times, often during particular phases of the moon or when certain stars were ascendant. The grinding and mixing of ingredients required prayers and incantations, while the final preparations were often blessed by priests or exposed to holy relics before being administered to patients. The plague doctor's approach to each household involved elaborate protocols designed to protect both physician and patient from spiritual as well as physical corruption. Many carried consecrated objects, wore blessed amulets, or recited specific prayers before entering infected areas. The costume itself was often blessed by religious authorities, transforming the plague doctor into a kind of medical priest, whose very presence was thought to provide spiritual as well as physical protection. The decline of these elaborate plague medicine theories came not through sudden revelation, but through the gradual accumulation of evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about disease, causation, and treatment. Physicians like Michel de Nostradame began to notice that simpler treatments often proved more effective than complex theoretical interventions, while careful observation revealed that many traditional practices actually seemed to worsen patient outcomes. The role of alchemy in plague medicine deserves particular attention, as it reveals how medieval physicians attempted to harness what they believed were fundamental, transformative forces in nature to combat disease. Alchemical theory held that all matter could be transformed through proper processes, and that the same principles that could turn base metals into gold might also transform diseased bodies back to health. This wasn't mere superstition, but represented a sophisticated theoretical framework that integrated chemistry, medicine, and philosophy into a unified system of understanding. Plague doctors who practiced alchemical medicine spent countless hours in their laboratories preparing elaborate compounds that combined mineral, plant, and animal substances according to precise formulas. These preparations often involved complex processes of distillation, calcination, and sublimation that could take weeks or even months to complete. The resulting medicines were incredibly expensive, reserved for wealthy patients who could afford treatments that required such extensive preparation. One particularly fascinating alchemical approach involved the creation of what physicians called potable gold, liquid gold preparations that were believed to contain the solar essence in its most pure and concentrated form. The process of creating potable gold involved dissolving gold in various acid solutions, then carefully processing the result through multiple stages of purification. Plague doctors administered these preparations to patients in tiny doses, believing that the incorruptible nature of gold would be transferred to the patient's body, providing immunity against plague corruption. The use of antimony in plague medicine represents another intriguing intersection of alchemy and medical practice. Antimony, a toxic metalloid element, was believed by alchemical physicians to possess unique purifying properties that could drive corruption from the body through violent purgation. Antimony preparations caused dramatic vomiting and diarrhea, which physicians interpreted as the physical expulsion of corrupt humors. That these treatments often killed patients was acknowledged but attributed to the patient's advanced state of corruption rather than the inherent toxicity of the treatment itself. The doctrine of signatures, a theoretical framework that profoundly influenced plague medicine, held that natural substances bore visual or sensory clues to their medical applications. According to this theory, God had marked plants, minerals, and other natural objects with signs indicating their proper medicinal uses. Plague doctors carefully studied the shapes, colors, and textures of potential medicines, looking for correspondences with diseased body parts or disease symptoms. Walnuts, for example, were used to treat brain ailments because their wrinkled surface resembled the brain's convolutions. Plants with red sap were employed to treat blood disorders, while yellow-flowered herbs were prescribed for liver complaints related to yellow bile. In the context of plague, physicians sought out black-colored substances, particularly charcoal and certain dark minerals, believing these would have natural affinity for the black corruption that characterized plague disease. The preparation of these medicines involved elaborate rituals that were considered as important as the ingredients themselves. Plague doctors believed that the efficacy of medicines could be enhanced or diminished based on the circumstances of their preparation. Herbs collected during specific phases of the moon, ground in mortar while reciting particular prayers, or mixed in vessels made from specific materials were all thought to produce more potent results. Some plague doctors maintained extensive astrological charts that specified the optimal times for preparing different medicines. A mercury-based preparation might need to be compounded on a Wednesday when Mercury was ascendant, while a gold-based medicine required preparation during solar hours on Sunday. These requirements meant that plague physicians often spent as much time consulting astronomical tables and waiting for propitious moments as they did actually treating patients. The theory of contagion, while primitive by modern standards, represented one area where medieval plague medicine actually approached correct understanding. Some physicians began to recognize that plague spread through contact with infected individuals or their possessions, even if they misunderstood the mechanism of transmission. This led to the development of quarantine practices that, despite their harsh implementation, actually did help to slow plague spread. The concept of quarantine itself reveals sophisticated understanding of disease patterns. The 40-day isolation period, from which the term quarantine derives, was based on careful observation that suggested a relationship between exposure to plague and the subsequent development of symptoms. While medieval physicians attributed this to the time required for corrupt influences to fully manifest, they had nonetheless identified a real phenomenon: the incubation period of infectious disease. Fumigation practices represented another area where medieval theory, though flawed, led to partially effective interventions. Plague doctors recommended burning aromatic woods, particularly juniper and pine, in infected spaces. They believed the smoke would purify corrupted air through the opposition of pure aromatic vapors against corrupt miasmas. While this theory was incorrect, the smoke did have some limited antiseptic properties and may have helped to repel plague-carrying fleas, though this benefit was entirely accidental. The practice of plague water preparation involved creating complex distillations of dozens of herbs and spices that patients were instructed to drink regularly as both treatment and prevention. Different physicians guarded their particular plague water recipes as valuable secrets, sometimes including 60 or more ingredients. The preparation process could take months, involving multiple stages of distillation and the careful blending of components according to astrological timing. One particularly elaborate plague water recipe that has survived in manuscript form includes crushed pearls, unicorn horn, emerald powder, gold leaf, 37 different herbs, various spices imported from Asia, and wine that had been aged for at least 7 years. The entire preparation was to be distilled 7 times, once for each of the classical planets, with each distillation occurring during the appropriate planetary hour. The resulting medicine was administered in drops, diluted in wine, 3 times daily according to a schedule determined by the patient's astrological chart. The economic dimensions of plague medicine reveal how these elaborate theories created entire industries devoted to supplying physicians with necessary materials. Apothecaries stocked hundreds of ingredients, from common local herbs to exotic imports like bezoar stones, allegedly formed in the stomachs of certain animals and believed to be universal antidotes to poison. The trade in medical materials during plague years represented significant commerce, with merchants risking their lives to transport valuable medicines to plague-stricken cities. The gradual recognition of plague medicine's failures created profound crises within medical institutions. Physicians had staked their professional authority on theoretical frameworks that promised understanding and treatment of disease. Yet the plague's relentless mortality made a mockery of these claims. Some physicians responded by developing ever more elaborate theories to explain why treatments failed, while others began the slow process of questioning fundamental assumptions about disease and healing. The intersection of religious and medical authority in plague treatment created additional layers of complexity. Church officials often promoted particular treatments or preventive measures based on theological reasoning, while physicians attempted to maintain their professional autonomy by appealing to medical theory. The result was sometimes creative synthesis, as when physicians incorporated blessed objects into their treatment regimens, and sometimes open conflict over whose authority should guide plague response. The documentation practices of plague physicians, their careful recording of symptoms, treatments, and outcomes, inadvertently laid groundwork for later medical advances, even though their theoretical interpretations were flawed. The detailed observations they recorded provided later generations with valuable data about plague progression and mortality patterns. These records would eventually contribute to genuine understanding of infectious disease, though this outcome was centuries away during the plague-doctor era. The psychological dimensions of adhering to elaborate medical theories during plague outbreaks cannot be overstated. For physicians facing incomprehensible mortality and their own likely death, These theories provided structure, meaning, and purpose. The rituals of preparation, the complex decision-making processes, and the detailed theoretical frameworks gave plague doctors something to hold on to in the face of chaos, even if their practical efficacy was minimal or non-existent. Yet the legacy of medieval plague medicine extends far beyond its obvious failures. The emphasis on protective equipment influenced the development of modern medical safety protocols, while the focus on environmental factors in disease transmission anticipated later discoveries about sanitation and public health. Most importantly, the systematic approach to understanding disease, however flawed its theoretical foundation, established precedents for scientific medicine that would eventually lead to genuine understanding of infectious disease. The mysterious medical theories behind plague medicine reveal a fascinating moment in human history when observation, theory, and desperation combined to create a complex system of healing that was simultaneously sophisticated and deeply flawed. Behind every leather beak and brass-headed cane lay centuries of accumulated knowledge and genuine attempts to understand the natural world. Efforts that ultimately failed to save most plague victims, but succeeded in preserving the essential human drive to heal, to understand, and to hope in the face of inexplicable catastrophe. When death knocked on golden doors, the elites escaped from plague, while the poor perished. While plague doctors and their leather beaks wandered through the cramped, pestilent quarters of the poor, administering futile treatments to those abandoned by fortune. An entirely different world existed just miles away. A world where wealth could purchase what medicine could not provide. Escape from death itself. The story of how Europe's elite responded to plague outbreaks reveals not just the vast gulf between rich and poor in medieval and Renaissance society, but the sophisticated networks of information, transportation, and luxury that allowed the wealthy to transform plague years into extended holidays, while entire communities of common people were erased from existence. The contrast could not have been more stark. As plague doctors made their grim rounds through overcrowded tenements, where entire families perished in single rooms, the wealthy were already implementing elaborate evacuation plans that had been refined over generations of epidemic experience. These weren't hasty flights from danger, but carefully orchestrated migrations that demonstrated the medieval elite's sophistication, understanding of disease patterns, travel logistics, and the geography of safety that their money could access. The Medici family of Florence provides perhaps the most illuminating example of how wealth transformed the plague experience. From inevitable catastrophe into manageable inconvenience. When reports of plague reached their palazzo, the Medici didn't wait for official confirmation or debate the merits of staying to help their city. Instead, they activated a network of country estates, mountain retreats, and allied noble houses that stretched across northern Italy, creating a circuit of luxury refuges where they could wait out the epidemic in comfort that exceeded even their urban lifestyle. Lorenzo de' Medici's plague journal, preserved in the family archives, reads like a travel diary from a grand tour, rather than the desperate flight from pestilence that it actually represented. His entries describe elaborate hunting parties at mountain lodges, extended stays at lakeside villas with their own private physicians, and cultural gatherings where the greatest artists and scholars of the age continued their work in pristine countryside settings, while their former neighbors in Florence died by the thousands. The Medici's plague retreat in 1478 involved a convoy of over 40 carriages carrying family members, servants, physicians, entertainers, and enough luxury goods to establish complete households in each of their destination properties. They transported their own furniture, their personal chefs, their private libraries, and even their favorite horses, creating mobile versions of their Florentine lifestyle that could be recreated wherever they chose to settle. The cost of this single evacuation exceeded the annual tax revenue of most European cities, yet it represented routine expenditure for a family whose wealth could purchase safety itself. But the Medici were far from unique in their approach to plague management. Throughout Europe, wealthy families maintained elaborate contingency plans that treated epidemic disease not as divine punishment or natural catastrophe, but as predictable inconvenience requiring logistical solutions. These families invested enormous resources in creating networks of safe refuges, maintaining detailed intelligence about disease outbreaks, and developing transportation systems that could move large households quickly and efficiently when danger threatened. The French nobility perfected perhaps the most sophisticated plague avoidance system in medieval Europe, centered around the concept of the Grand Depart, a coordinated evacuation that involved entire social networks moving simultaneously to predetermined safe locations. When plague threatened Paris, aristocratic families didn't simply flee individually, but implemented coordinated relocations that preserved their social structures and political influence, even while abandoning their urban responsibilities. The Château de Chambord, one of the most magnificent Renaissance palaces in France, was originally conceived not as a permanent residence, but as a plague refuge for the French court. Its remote location in the Loire Valley, its extensive grounds that could accommodate hundreds of nobles and their retinues, and its elaborate hunting facilities that could provide both entertainment and food security made it an ideal location for riding out epidemic outbreaks. During plague years, Chambord transformed from royal hunting lodge into the effective capital of France, complete with administrative offices, diplomatic facilities, and cultural institutions that allowed the business of government to continue uninterrupted. The daily life of nobles during plague retreats reveals the extraordinary lengths to which wealth could insulate individuals from the suffering that defined the plague experience for ordinary people. While common folk struggled to find clean water in plague-ravaged cities, aristocratic refugees enjoyed elaborate fountain systems that provided fresh mountain spring water to their temporary residences. While the poor survived on whatever scraps they could find in abandoned markets, noble households maintained their usual dietary standards through supply networks that brought fresh meat, imported spices, and fine wines to even the most remote refuges. The entertainment options available to wealthy plague refugees would have seemed obscene to those suffering in the cities they had abandoned. Noble households typically included professional musicians, troubadours, and storytellers whose job was to maintain morale during extended stays away from urban centers. Elaborate games were organized, from chess tournaments to elaborate hunts that could last for weeks. Some noble families commissioned artists to create works specifically for their plague retreats, resulting in some of the Renaissance's most beautiful art being created in direct response to epidemic disease. The medical care available to wealthy plague refugees represented a completely different universe from the desperate treatments administered by plague doctors to the urban poor, while common people received bloodletting purgatives and prayers from physicians who might treat dozens of patients per day. Wealthy families retained personal physicians who provided individualized care based on the most advanced medical knowledge available. These private doctors had access to expensive medications imported from across the known world, sophisticated diagnostic techniques, and the luxury of time that allowed for careful observation and treatment adjustment. The preventive measures available to the wealthy were equally extraordinary. While poor families crowded together in single rooms with infected relatives, wealthy households could implement perfect quarantine protocols. isolating potentially infected individuals in comfortable apartments with dedicated servants and medical staff. They could afford to burn all potentially contaminated clothing and possessions, replacing them with entirely new wardrobes. They could maintain elaborate hygiene regimens involving imported soaps, perfumes, and bathing facilities that were completely unavailable to the common population. Perhaps most remarkably, wealthy families often maintained multiple residences simultaneously during plague outbreaks, moving between them according to detailed intelligence reports about disease patterns. A noble family might maintain households in 3 or 4 different locations, rotating between them every few weeks to ensure that they never remained in any single place long enough for potential contamination to develop. This constant movement required enormous financial resources, but provided the ultimate protection against a disease that seemed to strike randomly and without warning. The information networks available to the wealthy allowed them to make informed decisions about when and where to flee that were completely unavailable to common people. Aristocratic families maintained networks of correspondents who provided detailed reports about plague outbreaks, trade disruptions, and safe routes of travel. They received advance warning of epidemic outbreaks, weeks or even months before official announcements, allowing them to evacuate before travel became dangerous or impossible. These intelligence networks were remarkably sophisticated, involving merchants, diplomats, church officials, and professional couriers who provided constant updates about conditions throughout Europe. Wealthy families could track the progress of plague outbreaks across multiple countries, predict when epidemics might reach their territories, and plan evacuation routes that avoided infected areas entirely. This information was so valuable that some noble families essentially operated their own diplomatic services, maintaining permanent representatives in major cities whose primary responsibility was plague surveillance. The transportation resources available to the wealthy transformed evacuation from desperate flight into comfortable relocation, while common people fled on foot with whatever possessions they could carry. Aristocratic families traveled in specially designed carriages that provided comfort and protection during long journeys. These vehicles were equipped with their own food supplies, sleeping accommodations, and even portable medical facilities. Some wealthy families maintained private ships that could transport entire households across water barriers that might block plague transmission. The luxury accommodations available at plague refuges often exceeded the standards of normal urban living. Mountain retreats, maintained by wealthy families, included elaborate kitchens, extensive libraries, private chapels, and entertainment facilities that made extended stays not just bearable, but genuinely pleasant. Some aristocratic plague refuges included their own vineyards, gardens, and workshops, creating self-sufficient communities that could maintain high living standards indefinitely. The social structures that developed within these refugee communities revealed how wealth could preserve not just life, but entire ways of living during plague outbreaks. Noble families often retreated together, maintaining their usual social hierarchies and cultural practices in exile. They continued to hold court, conduct business, arrange marriages, and engage in political activities as if plague were merely an inconvenient change of scenery rather than a mortal threat. The education and cultural activities available to wealthy children during plague retreats ensured that aristocratic families could maintain their intellectual advantages even during extended absences from urban centers. Private tutors, extensive libraries, and cultural activities meant that noble children often received better educations during plague years than they might have in normal circumstances. Some families used plague retreats as opportunities for extended cultural immersion, commissioning scholars and artists to provide intensive training in subjects that might be neglected during busy urban social seasons. The financial mechanisms that supported these elaborate plague avoidance strategies revealed the sophisticated economic planning that characterized medieval and Renaissance wealth management. Wealthy families didn't simply flee with whatever cash they could carry, but maintained complex financial arrangements that allowed them to access resources wherever they might travel. They established credit relationships with merchants in multiple cities, maintained deposits with banking houses throughout Europe, and often owned properties specifically purchased as plague refuges. The contrast between elite plague experiences and those of common people extended even to death itself. While poor plague victims were buried in mass graves or simply left where they died, wealthy individuals who succumbed to plague despite all their precautions received elaborate funeral rites and burial in family tombs. Their deaths were recorded in detailed genealogies and commemorated with artistic monuments, ensuring that even in death, wealth could provide dignity and remembrance denied to common plague victims. The psychological impact of these vast disparities in plague experience cannot be overstated. While poor communities developed fatalistic attitudes toward epidemic disease, accepting mass death as inevitable divine punishment, wealthy families maintained optimism and agency, confident that their resources could protect them from even the most catastrophic outbreaks. This confidence often proved justified, as mortality rates among the wealthy were dramatically lower than those experienced by urban populations. The long-term social consequences of these differential plague experiences helped to entrench medieval class distinctions and justify aristocratic privilege. Wealthy families who successfully avoided plague casualties could point to their survival as evidence of divine favor or superior wisdom, while devastated poor communities were seen as having somehow deserved their fate. The ability to escape plague became another marker of aristocratic superiority, reinforcing social hierarchies that would persist for centuries. Yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of elite plague avoidance was how completely it separated the wealthy from the suffering they helped create through their abandonment of urban responsibilities. While plague doctors risked their lives, treating the poor in cities abandoned by their rulers, those rulers lived in comfort that was enhanced rather than diminished by the epidemic crisis. The contrast reveals not just the practical effects of wealth, but the moral dimensions of privilege in societies where survival itself had become a luxury commodity. The architectural legacy of plague avoidance reveals how deeply the fear of epidemic disease shaped elite living spaces for centuries after the Black Death first swept through Europe. Wealthy families didn't just flee to existing country estates, but commissioned the construction of purpose-built plague refuges designed with specific features meant to enhance safety and comfort during extended epidemic periods. These structures incorporated the latest theories about disease prevention, creating buildings that were as much medical instruments as they were residential palaces. The ideal plague refuge, according to Renaissance architectural treatises, should be situated on elevated ground where air circulation would be optimal, near fresh water sources but away from marshes or stagnant pools believed to generate corrupt vapors. The buildings themselves featured high ceilings to allow harmful airs to rise away from inhabitants, large windows positioned to maximize cross-ventilation, and separate quarters for servants to minimize contact between household members. Some wealthy families incorporated multiple layers of courtyards and gardens, creating buffer zones between the outside world and their living spaces. The Villa Medici in Fiesole, perched in the hills overlooking Florence, exemplifies this architectural philosophy. Commissioned in the mid-15th century partly as a plague refuge, the villa's design emphasized airiness, light, and separation from potential sources of contamination. Its elevated position provided not just spectacular views, but also what Medici physicians believed was access to purer air untainted by the corrupt miasmas that supposedly caused plague. The elaborate gardens surrounding the villa created a self-contained world where aristocratic families could wait out epidemics in unprecedented comfort. The provisioning strategies employed by wealthy families during plague retreats demonstrated logistical sophistication that would be impressive by any era's standards. Long before the first plague cases appeared in a region, aristocratic households began stockpiling supplies that could sustain them for months or even years of isolation. These weren't simple stores of grain and salt meat, but elaborate collections of luxury foods, rare wines, medicinal herbs, and entertainment materials that allowed the wealthy to maintain their accustomed lifestyle regardless of external circumstances. Some noble families maintained permanent stores in their country estates, regularly rotated and refreshed to ensure quality. These storage facilities often rivaled the size of the main house, with separate buildings for grain storage, wine cellars that could hold thousands of bottles, smoking houses for meat preservation, and specialized storage for spices, oils, and other valuable commodities. The investment in these facilities was enormous, but it ensured that when plague struck, wealthy families could simply activate pre-existing systems rather than scrambling to provision themselves during crisis. The culinary experiences available to wealthy plague refugees often exceeded what they enjoyed during normal times in the city. With extended periods in the countryside, noble households had access to fresh game from hunting, fish from private ponds and streams, and vegetables from extensive gardens tended by workers who lived on the estate. Professional chefs, retained as permanent household staff, could experiment with elaborate dishes that required hours of preparation, impossible during the busy social seasons of urban life. Detailed household accounts from plague years reveal the extraordinary variety and quality of food consumed by aristocratic refugees. The Duke of Burgundy's household records from a plague retreat in 1439 list daily consumption of venison, wild boar, multiple varieties of fish, dozens of types of bread and pastries, imported fruits, and wines from across Europe. The food expenses for his household during 6 months of plague retreat exceeded the annual income of most European towns, yet this was considered normal and appropriate for a family of his rank. The medical resources available to wealthy plague refugees went far beyond access to personal physicians. Many aristocratic estates included their own apothecaries, essentially private pharmacies stocked with expensive medicines and rare ingredients. Some wealthy families maintained permanent staff positions for herbalists, alchemists, and medical assistants who could prepare remedies according to the latest theories, without the delays or quality concerns associated with commercial apothecaries. The most elaborate noble households employed multiple physicians simultaneously during plague outbreaks, allowing for consultation and second opinions on treatment approaches. These physicians often represented different schools of medical thought, providing their patrons with access to diverse therapeutic options. If one physician's remedies proved ineffective, another could be consulted without the delay or difficulty that would be involved in summoning a new doctor from distant locations. The educational and cultural opportunities available to aristocratic children during plague retreats often exceeded what they could access in urban centers, without the distractions of social obligations and court appearances. Wealthy families used plague years to provide intensive educational experiences for their children. Private tutors, musicians, artists, and scholars were essentially captive in country estates, able to devote their full attention to the education of young nobles. Some of the Renaissance's greatest artistic and literary achievements were created during plague retreats, as wealthy patrons commissioned works from artists and writers who were effectively trapped in country estates, alongside their aristocratic employers. The combination of enforced leisure, abundant resources, and the psychological need to create meaning in the face of external catastrophe produced an outpouring of cultural production that might never have occurred under normal circumstances. The religious practices of wealthy plague refugees differ dramatically from those available to urban populations trapped in plague zones. While common people often found themselves without access to priests or religious services as clergy died or fled, aristocratic households maintained private chaplains who could provide daily masses, hear confessions, and administer sacraments. Some noble estates included elaborate private chapels that rivaled the finest urban churches, allowing wealthy families to maintain their spiritual practices without exposure to the dangers of public worship. The psychological and emotional support available to wealthy refugees extended far beyond what most plague victims could access. While common people faced disease and death in isolation or with only immediate family members for support, aristocratic households included networks of companions, entertainers, and counselors whose job was to maintain morale during difficult times. Professional musicians provided evening entertainment. Jesters and storytellers offered distraction from grim external realities, and trusted advisors were available for private consultation about fears and concerns. The correspondence networks maintained by wealthy families during plague outbreaks reveal sophisticated information management systems that kept them connected to events throughout Europe even during extended retreats. Professional couriers, often riding relay systems that changed horses at regular intervals, could deliver messages between plague refuges in days rather than weeks. These communication networks allowed aristocratic families to coordinate their movements, share information about safe routes and dangerous regions, and maintain business and political relationships despite physical separation. The economic impacts of aristocratic plague flight rippled through entire regional economies in ways that reinforced class divisions for generations. When wealthy families fled cities, they took with them not just their persons, but their economic patronage. Their servants, artisans, merchants, and entertainers who depended on aristocratic spending for their livelihoods found themselves suddenly without income precisely when economic support was most desperately needed. Meanwhile, the rural areas that hosted plague refugees experienced temporary economic booms as wealthy households purchased supplies, hired additional staff, and commissioned construction projects. The legal and political mechanisms that protected aristocratic plague flight reveal how thoroughly class privilege was embedded in medieval and Renaissance society. In most European jurisdictions, wealthy individuals faced no penalties for abandoning their urban residencies during plague outbreaks, while common people who attempted to flee were often forcibly returned to plague zones or punished for breaking quarantine. The same authorities who locked poor families into infected houses turned blind eyes to aristocratic departures. Some cities even formalized these double standards in plague regulations that explicitly exempted nobility from quarantine requirements applied to common citizens. The justification, when offered at all, typically invoked the greater value of aristocratic lives and the supposed necessity of preserving noble bloodlines. In practice, this meant that wealth literally purchased exemption from the rules that governed everyone else, turning survival itself into a privilege of class rather than a human right. The marriage strategies employed by wealthy families during plague years reveal another dimension of how privilege shaped survival. Aristocratic families used plague periods to arrange marriages between their children and the offspring of other families in their refuge networks. These plague marriages created alliance systems that reinforced the social and economic advantages of families, whose wealth had allowed them to survive epidemic outbreaks. Meanwhile, common families who lost members to plague found their marriage, prospects, and economic opportunities diminished, creating a cycle where plague survival became both cause and consequence of class privilege. As we conclude our journey through the eerie world of plague doctors and the dark realities of medieval epidemic disease, we're left with profound questions about how societies respond to crises, how privilege shapes survival, and how the distance between wealth and poverty can literally become the distance between life and death. The leather-beaked figures who walked through plague-ravaged streets were not just medical practitioners, but symbols of humanity's struggle against incomprehensible catastrophe, while the golden refuges of the elite remind us that for some, even the darkest chapters of human history could be transformed into opportunities for comfort and luxury. Thank you for joining me on this exploration into one of history's most haunting medical chapters. The world of plague doctors reveals not just the evolution of medical practice, but the profound ways that crises exposes the fundamental structures of human society. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful and your curiosity about the past continue to grow. Remember to share your thoughts about what historical topics you'd like us to explore next, and sweet dreams to you all, wherever in the world you may be.